In this video, we'll look at every person executed in the United States in 2024. Together, these 25 inmates spent 551 years on death row. We will look at the crimes that put them there, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. Let's start with the first execution of the year, on January 25th, when Kenneth Eugene Smith was executed. But the story behind that sentence began more than 36 years earlier in Alabama. On March 18, 1988, 45-year-old Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett opened the door of her home in Colbert County, Alabama, unaware that death had just stepped inside. She was kind, polite, and believed the two young men standing before her were simply looking to scout hunting property with her husband's permission. But her husband, Charles Sennett, a minister deep in debt, had a very different idea. He paid $3,000 to a tenant, Billy Gray Williams, to have her killed. But Billy didn't do the job himself. He passed it to John Parker and Kenneth Smith and promised them both $1,000. Once inside, John slipped cotton socks over his hands, a simple attempt to avoid leaving prints. Then he attacked. Elizabeth begged them not to hurt her, but John and Kenneth had no mercy. They beat her with a pipe and stabbed her repeatedly. Then they broke the medicine cabinet and stole a stereo and VCR to make it look like a robbery. Elizabeth died there in the home she shared with her husband, the same man who had orchestrated her murder. A week after suspicion began turning toward him, Charles took his own life. In 1989, Kenneth was convicted of capital murder. Though the jury recommended life without parole, the judge overrode their decision and sentenced him to death. John Parker was also sentenced to death and was executed in 2010, and Billy Williams is serving life without parole. On January 25, 2024, after spending 35 years on death row, Kenneth's final appeal was rejected, and his execution was set for that evening. He ate a last meal of steak, hash browns, and eggs, and visited with his wife and sons. While strapped to the gurney, he spoke his last words. "Tonight, Alabama causes humanity to take a step backwards. Thank you for supporting me. Love, all of you." At 7:57 p.m., nitrogen gas began flowing through the mask. Witnesses said he appeared conscious for several minutes and struggled before movement slowed. But his spiritual advisor, who watched the whole thing, called it the most horrible thing I've ever seen. The curtain closed at 8:15 p.m., and 10 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. Kenneth Eugene Smith was 58 years old. And if you thought this was shocking, wait until you hear what the next man did. On the night of November 4th, 2000, in a quiet neighborhood of North Dallas, gunshots tore through the home of 27-year-old James Mosqueda and his girlfriend, 22-year-old Amy Kitchen. They were found the next morning. James was shot multiple times near the front entrance, while Amy was found lying lifeless in the bedroom. Their lives had been ended in cold blood, and suspicion quickly turned toward someone close, James's cousin, Ivan Cantu. The police believed that Ivan had killed them over a drug deal gone wrong, and they arrested him just days later. Prosecutors argued he staged a break-in and used James's car and Rolex to throw investigators off. At trial, two key witnesses helped build the case. One of them even was Ivan's ex-fiancée. But years later, she claimed that she had lied. Still, back in October 2001, the jury convicted Ivan of capital murder. He was sentenced to death and spent 22 years on death row, all while insisting he was innocent. His case gained national attention. Sister Helen Prejean, known for fighting the death penalty, stood by him. So did podcasters, lawyers, and activists who said the evidence never added up. They pointed to missing fingerprints, shifting testimonies, and an alibi that was never fully checked. But none of it stopped the execution. The court said he had his chance, and the date was set. On February 28, 2024, Ivan was served a standard last meal. Texas no longer honors special requests. In his last words, Ivan turned to the victims' families and said, "I want you all to know that I don't think that this situation here will bring you closure." He added that if he had known who the real killer was, he would have spoken up long ago. At 6:26 p.m., the first dose of pentobarbital was pushed through the IV, and 21 minutes later, at 6:47, he was pronounced dead. Ivan Cantu was 50 years old. What do you think? Did he do it? Let us know in the comments. Now let's fast forward to March 2024, when the next inmate was executed. Let's look at what he did. On November 17, 1993, in Thomaston, Georgia, Alicia Yarbrough was home alone with her baby when her former boyfriend, 28-year-old Willie Pye, showed up with 2 men and a pistol. He hadn't gotten over her, not since their breakup, and not since she'd had a child with another man. He believed the baby was his, and it ate at him that he wasn't listed as the father on the birth certificate. That night, Willie, Anthony Freeman, and Chester Adams planned to rob Alicia's boyfriend's home. But they didn't expect Alicia to be there, and the robbery quickly turned into something else. They forced her into a car, took her to a motel, and all 3 of them raped her. Then they stole her jewelry and drove to a dirt road outside town. Willie told Alicia to get out. He made her lie down in the dirt, then shot her 3 times. Her body was found that same day. It didn't take long for the police to arrest the trio. Anthony, who was just 15 years old, confessed straight away and said that Willie was the one who pulled the trigger, and DNA backed that up. Willie denied it all, but the evidence didn't. 3 years later, in 1996, a jury convicted Willie of murder, kidnapping, burglary, and robbery. He was sentenced to death, along with 3 life sentences and an extra 20 years for the burglary. He stayed on death row for 27 years. On March 20th, 2024, Willie ordered 2 chicken sandwiches, 2 cheeseburgers, fries, 2 bags of chips, and 2 lemon-lime sodas. He met with family, a chaplain, and his attorney. He accepted a prayer, but gave no final statement. At 11 p.m., the lethal drugs were pushed into his system. He was pronounced dead minutes later, at 11:03. Willie James Pye was 59 years old. Wow, that was just savage. Now let's continue with the next one. On the morning of February 22, 2002, 2 murders shattered Oklahoma City, just hours apart. The first victim was Janet Moore, a 41-year-old mother getting ready for work. And the second was 22-year-old Sarath Puluru, a store clerk and student from India working the night shift. The killer, 19-year-old Michael Smith. Michael was already a wanted man for another killing and deeply involved with the Oak Grove Posse, a violent street gang. But what happened that day was brutal, senseless, and, for those who knew the victims, impossible to forget. Michael had been looking for Janet's son, a man he thought had ratted him out, but instead he found Janet alone at home. She screamed when he kicked in the door, and he shot her dead on the spot. Hours later, he stormed into the store where Sarath worked and unloaded 2 guns worth of bullets into him. Sarath begged to know why, but it didn't matter. Afterward, Michael poured lighter fluid over the body and set the store on fire. He did this because he thought that Sarath had disrespected his gang, but it turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. Sarath hadn't said a word. The police arrested Michael 2 days later. He was already being investigated for the murder of 26-year-old Otis Payne, who was shot outside a nightclub months earlier. Michael first denied everything, but he eventually confessed to all 3 killings. In 2003, a jury convicted him of 2 counts of first-degree murder for killing Janet and Sarath, and sentenced him to death. The next year, he was sentenced to life for Otis's murder. In total, he spent 21 years on death row. On April 4, 2024, Michael declined to order a special final meal. Instead, he ate what was available in the prison canteen. He also refused to give any final words, simply saying, "Nah, I'm good." At 10:20 a.m., after receiving the lethal injection, he was pronounced dead. Michael Dewayne Smith was 41 years old. Just a couple of days later, the next inmate was scheduled to die. Let's see what he did. On December 23, 2006, in New Bloomfield, Missouri, Brian Dorsey called his cousin Sarah, asking for help. He owed money to drug dealers, and he was desperate. Sarah and her husband Ben didn't hesitate. They picked Brian up and brought him into their home. That night, with their 4-year-old daughter asleep just steps away, Brian crept into their bedroom with a shotgun. He shot Sarah in the face at close range, then reloaded and shot Ben. Both died instantly. Afterward, Brian assaulted Sarah's body, stole some valuables, and left their daughter alone in the living room. Sarah's parents found the bodies the next day when the couple failed to show up for a Christmas gathering. Just 3 days later, Brian turned himself in and confessed. He said he didn't remember pulling the trigger and claimed he had been high on drugs, but there was no denying what he had done. In 2008, Brian pled guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. A jury sentenced him to death, and he spent 15 years on Missouri's death row. Over time, he became a model inmate, working as a prison barber and earning the respect of both staff and other prisoners. More than 70 prison employees, 5 former jurors, and even a former judge who upheld his sentence later asked the governor to spare his life. But Sarah and Ben's relatives wanted justice. They remembered what Brian did, not just to the couple, but to their daughter, who was left without parents just before Christmas. For his last meal, Brian ordered a feast: 2 bacon double cheeseburgers, 2 orders of chicken strips, 2 large seasoned fries, and a sausage and pepperoni pizza with onions, mushrooms, and extra cheese. When asked for his final words, Brian said, "Words cannot hold the just weight of my guilt and shame." If you want to read his full statement, you can pause the video here. He was executed by lethal injection in Missouri on April 9, 2024. Brian Dorsey was 52 years old. The next execution was scheduled for May 30th, but how did he end up on death row? On June 24, 2004, in the quiet town of Glen, Alabama, 87-year-old Floyd Hill and his 72-year-old wife Vera opened their door to a familiar face: Jamie Mills, their neighbor. And he wasn't alone. His wife, Joanne, stood beside him. They asked to borrow the phone, and the Hills let them in, unaware of what was about to happen. Jamie and Joanne had just come off a methamphetamine binge, and what followed inside that home would leave a permanent mark on the small community. Once inside, Jamie immediately attacked. He beat Floyd with a machete, tire tool, and ball-peen hammer in the shed. And when Vera ran over to help her husband after hearing his screams, Jamie turned on her. He bludgeoned her too, leaving both victims critically injured. The couple then stole $140 and prescription pills before walking away from the bloodshed they left behind. When Floyd and Vera's children and grandchildren weren't able to reach them, they called the police. An officer sent to check up on them found them in a locked shed, and the horror inside the Hill home came to light. They were still alive, but barely. Floyd died at the scene, and Vera survived only a few more weeks. Jamie was arrested the next day. At trial in 2007, Joanne testified against him, saying she watched her husband kill both Floyd and Vera. She had agreed to plead guilty to a lesser charge in exchange for her testimony, and was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. She remains in prison to this day. Jamie was found guilty of capital murder, and the jury voted 11-1 for the death penalty. He spent 16 years on death row. On May 30th, Jamie chose a seafood platter with shrimp, catfish, oysters, onion rings, and a stuffed crab as his last meal. With his final words, he expressed love for his brother and sister, who watched from the witness room. "I love my family. I love my brother and sister. I couldn't ask for more." As he said the words, he looked in their direction. He also thanked his defense attorney, Charlotte Morrison of the Equal Justice Initiative, stating, "Charlotte, you fought hard for me." But he didn't address the victims. He then simply said, "I love y'all. Carry on." When the drugs entered his system, Jamie said nothing more. At 6:26 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Jamie Ray Mills was 50 years old. Because of the feasts both Brian and Jamie ordered for their last meals, the discussion about providing death row inmates with last meals started again. What do you think? Should they be allowed a special final meal? Now let's continue. On September 28, 2009, police in Jefferson City, Missouri, found 45-year-old Angela and 61-year-old Rodney Gilpin shot dead inside their apartment. Angela had been in a long-term affair with David Hosier, but the relationship fell apart when she decided to reconcile with her husband. But she didn't know that that choice would cost her everything. Investigators quickly uncovered voicemails, messages, and police reports showing that David had stalked and threatened Angela in the weeks leading up to the murders, and when they arrested him in Oklahoma days later, they found 15 guns in his car, including a Sten submachine gun and a handwritten note detailing how he would get revenge on Angela. At first, he denied everything, but the case moved forward anyway. The jury heard about the threats, the stalking, and the weapons, and it took them less than 2 hours to convict him. 2 days later, they returned a unanimous sentence: death. On June 11, 2024, after spending 10 years on death row, David had his final meal: a New York strip steak, a baked potato with butter and sour cream, Texas toast, Dutch apple pie, orange juice, and milk. His final words were soft but clear: "I leave you all with love. Now I get to go to heaven. Don't cry for me. Just join me when your time comes." If you want to read his full statement, you can pause the video here. At 6:11 p.m., he was pronounced dead after a lethal injection was carried out. David Russell Hosier was 69 years old. 2 weeks later, time ran out for the next inmate. But what did he do? On January 15, 2001, 18-year-old Bridget Townsend vanished from her boyfriend's home in Bandera County, Texas. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of obvious struggle. She was just gone. Her family searched, prayed, and waited. Days turned into months, and for more than a year, they had no answers, until an 18-year-old who was already in prison asked to speak with the sheriff. Ramiro Gonzales said he knew what happened, because he was the one who did it. That day, Ramiro had broken into the house hoping to steal cocaine, but Bridget was there. He tied her up, ransacked the place, and took whatever cash he could find. Then he forced her into his truck, drove her to his grandfather's ranch, and raped her. When it was over, he picked up a rifle and shot her. He left her body in a field and never looked back. It wasn't until after he was caught for another crime, a kidnapping, and 9 months after the attack on Bridget, that he finally confessed to killing her. And in October 2002, police found her remains exactly where he said they would be. Ramiro was charged with capital murder and went on trial in 2006. A state psychiatrist testified that Ramiro was dangerous and would re-offend, and the jury gave him the death sentence. He spent 17 years on death row. But over the years, the story changed, and Ramiro's behavior in prison was clean, his faith sincere, and he even offered to donate a kidney. He wrote letters to Bridget's family, apologized, and begged for forgiveness, but it wasn't enough. And in 2024, a date was set, June 26th, the day Bridget would have turned 42. In his final hours, Ramiro wasn't allowed to choose a special final meal and just had what the other inmates were having. His last words were for Bridget's family: "I can't put into words the pain I caused y'all. I never stopped praying for you. I owe all of you my life." That evening, he was given a lethal dose of pentobarbital. At 6:50, he was pronounced dead. Ramiro Felix Gonzales was 41 years old. The very next day, the next inmate was executed. Let's see what he did to end up on death row. On the evening of July 6, 1984, in Elk City, Oklahoma, 7-year-old Layla Cummings was home alone with her older brother while their mother worked a late shift at a fast food restaurant. But just hours later, Layla was gone. And the next morning, a farmer found her body in a field outside town. she was brutally raped and stabbed to death. Police quickly focused on Richard Rojem Jr., Layla's former stepfather and a convicted sex offender who had only recently been released from prison. Layla had previously accused him of sexual abuse, and her mother had just finalized their divorce 2 months earlier. Investigators found his fingerprints at the scene, tire tracks matching his vehicle near the body, and a condom wrapper that matched one found in his bedroom. They believed he had planned the abduction, knowing Layla's mother's work schedule and the broken door lock. Richard had a violent past, including 2 teenage girls. He was sentenced to 2 concurrent sentences of 6 to 15 years imprisonment, but he served only 4. He later married Layla's mother, but the relationship quickly unraveled. She accused him of sexual violence, filed for divorce, and got a restraining order. But that wasn't enough. With the front door lock broken, Richard simply slipped inside and kidnapped Layla. Richard was arrested weeks later and charged with kidnapping and murder. In 1985, a jury took just 45 minutes to convict him. They sentenced him to 1,000 years each for and kidnapping and death for the murder. But his time on death row stretched far longer than anyone expected. Over the next 4 decades, Richard fought the sentence at every turn. Every appeal failed, and by 2017, all legal options were exhausted. With almost 40 years on death row, Richard became Oklahoma's longest-serving inmate. During his time behind bars, Richard remained violent and defiant. He was caught with weapons, assaulted staff, and even got tangled in a murder-for-hire plot tied to another death row inmate. Still, when his execution date was finally set for June 27, 2024, he asked for mercy. At his clemency hearing, he claimed he didn't kill Layla and asked to spend the rest of his life in prison. But the board voted unanimously. No clemency. For his last meal, he requested a Little Caesars pizza with double cheese and double pepperoni, 8 packets each of salt and red pepper, 2 vanilla ice cream cups, and a bottle of ginger ale. When asked for final words, he simply said, "I don't. I've said my goodbyes." On the morning of June 27, 2024, he was strapped to the gurney at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. The drugs were administered, and at 10:16 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Richard Norman Rojem Jr. was 66 years old. A month later, the next inmate was strapped to the gurney. Let's see what for. On March 6, 1998, 68-year-old William Clayton was finishing his shift as a contract courier in Center, Alabama. He was preparing to take his wife out to dinner. But first, he had to make a quick stop by a local ATM to grab some cash. As he sat in his work van, Keith Gavin approached him with a stolen .40 caliber Glock, opened the side door, and fired 2 shots into William's chest. Then he shoved the wounded man across the seat, took the wheel, and drove off. The police chased the stolen van through town until Keith eventually bailed out at an intersection and sprinted into the woods. He opened fire on the officer behind him, but missed. But he didn't get far. A police dog sniffed him out near a creek where officers arrested him. William, left behind in the van, was still alive but barely. He had 3 gunshot wounds. 1 bullet ripped through his arm and heart, and he died later at the hospital. The entire attack was witnessed by Keith's own cousin and 3 bystanders, all of whom testified that Keith had pulled the trigger. To make things even worse, Keith had been out of prison for just 4 months. 16 years earlier, in 1982, he had been convicted of murder in Chicago. But the system gave him a second chance, and within weeks, another man was dead. In 1999, an Alabama jury found him guilty of capital murder and attempted murder and sentenced him to death. He spent the next 24 years on death row. On July 18, 2024, Keith didn't request a special last meal. The night before, he snacked on chips, a candy bar, and drank some Mountain Dew. On the day of his execution, he skipped all 3 meals. When asked for final words, Keith simply said, "I love my family," and recited a Muslim prayer before closing his eyes. The drugs entered his system at 6:16 p.m. and he was pronounced dead at 6:32. Keith Edmund Gavin was 64 years old. 2 weeks later, another execution was planned, this time in Texas. On July 29, 1997, in Houston, Texas, 48-year-old Nancy Adelman laced up her running shoes for her usual evening jog, but she never made it home to her 3 children. The next day, her body was found in a wooded area along Bray's Bayou. Her clothes were torn, her body was bruised, and her shoelaces had been used to strangle her. Police began piecing together what had happened, and within days a witness recalled seeing a man on a bike near Nancy's neighborhood, someone with an angry look who didn't belong there. That man was Arthur Lee Burton. Arthur, a 27-year-old father of 4 with a long criminal history, was arrested 10 days after the murder. At first, he denied everything, but after hours of questioning and evidence that contradicted his story, he confessed. He said he had tried to rape Nancy during her jog, and when she resisted, he killed her. Later, he took it back, claiming that the confession was forced and that he was intellectually disabled. But the details he gave matched the crime scene, and prosecutors believed they had their man. In June 1998, a jury convicted Arthur of capital murder and sentenced him to death. He spent his next 26 years on death row. On August 7, 2024, Arthur had his final meal from the prison canteen. His final words were simple: "I hope that I find peace and y'all can too. Warden, I am good," and said, "Bird is going home." At 6:23 p.m., the lethal drugs were pushed into his system, and he was pronounced dead 24 minutes later. Arthur Lee Burton was 54 years old. Just 1 day later, the next man was scheduled to die. Let's see what he did. On July 9, 1998, in Cedar City, Utah, 22-year-old Taberon Honie made a threatening call to his ex-girlfriend, Carol. He demanded that she come see him and warned her that if she didn't, he would kill members of her family. But Carol wasn't impressed by his threats and left for work that night, not realizing that her mother's life was in danger. Just hours later, Taberon followed through on his threat and broke into her home by smashing through a glass door. Inside was 49-year-old Claudia Ben, Carol's mother, and a respected substance abuse counselor in her community. Claudia tried to fight him off with a kitchen knife, but Taberon overpowered her. He slashed her throat 4 times, sexually abused and mutilated her before raping one of her young granddaughters. When police arrived, they found Claudia dead, the children covered in blood, and Taberon in the garage. His fingers were stained with blood. He told officers, "I stabbed her. I killed her with a knife." In 1999, a Utah judge sentenced Taberon to death for aggravated murder, rape, and burglary. He waived a jury trial, and a single judge handed down the death sentence. He remained on death row for 25 years, filing multiple appeals over the decades.
I'm not a threat to the public. I'm not a threat to anyone.
But the courts rejected every single one. On August 8, 2024, he was the first man executed in Utah in 10 years. For his final meal, he had a cheeseburger, fries, and a milkshake. At midnight, Taberon spoke his final words: "If this is what it takes for them to heal, let's do this. To all my brothers and sisters here, continue to change." He thanked the prison staff for treating his family with care. The first dose didn't stop his heart, so a second was administered, and he was pronounced dead at 12:25 a.m. Taberon Dave Honie was 48 years old. On August 29th, Florida executed their first inmate of the year. But what did he do? On February 18, 1994, 18-year-old John Edwards and his sister Pam, who was 21, met in Ocala National Forest, Florida, for a fun weekend of camping. Both were college students at different places, and this was their way to catch up after being apart for a while. They pitched their tent, shared dinner by the fire, and welcomed a stranger who called himself Kevin, who had helped them to set up camp. But that man wasn't Kevin. He was Loran Kenstley Cole, and he wasn't there to help. Later, he returned with another man he claimed was his brother. The four of them had a nice evening around the campfire. Then they agreed to take a walk to the pond to photograph the alligators. But there were no alligators, just a calculated ambush in a dark forest. Loran handcuffed Pam and slammed her to the ground. When John tried to fight back to help his sister, both men overpowered him. Loran's partner dragged Pam away, while Loran stayed behind and slit John's throat and then bashed his head in. John died alone in the woods, while Pam was raped twice, once that night, again the next morning. Then she was tied to a tree and left for dead. The men stole the siblings' car and valuables and drove off, thinking nothing would link them to the crimes, but they were wrong. Pam survived. She chewed through the rope with her teeth, ran barefoot through the forest, and flagged down help. That same day, police found John's body. The arrests came fast when someone recognized the men from the police sketches. Loran was 27. He had a long rap sheet, a fake name, and a history of violence. His partner, William Paul, cut a deal and avoided death row. But Loran didn't get that option. In 1995, after listening to Pam testify about every brutal second, a jury found him guilty of murder, kidnapping, and robbery, and he was sentenced to die. For 28 years, Loran fought the sentence, but it was too late. On August 29, 2024, Loran shared his last meal, pizza, M&Ms, ice cream, and soda with his son and a pen pal. He declined to speak any final words. At 6 p.m., the drugs began flowing, and at 6:15, he was pronounced dead. Loran Kenstley Cole was 57 years old. A month later, the next inmate had his final day, but how did he end up strapped to a gurney? On November 1, 1997, in Greenville, South Carolina, Irene Graves clocked in for her night shift at a corner store. She was 41, a single mom to 3 kids, and was working late hours to keep her family afloat. It was supposed to be a routine shift, but just before midnight, 2 masked men pushed through the door, and one of them had a gun. Irene did what anyone would do. She raised her hands and tried to comply. But the safe wouldn't open, and in that moment, the man in the ski mask pulled the trigger. A single gunshot to the head ended her life for $37 and some change. That man was 19-year-old Freddie Owens. Freddie was arrested 10 days later and charged with murder. His accomplice, Stephen Golden, cut a deal and avoided death row by testifying that Freddie pulled the trigger. And just hours after the jury convicted him in 1999, Freddie killed again. In a crowded holding cell, he stabbed and strangled another inmate, Christopher Lee, using a pen, a bedsheet, and a lighter. A day later, at his sentence hearing, he calmly confessed in open court, saying the man had mocked his conviction. But he claimed innocence, even as he described the violence in detail. The jury didn't flinch. They gave him death. During his 25 years on death row, Freddie changed, at least on the outside. He converted to Islam, called himself Khalil Divine Black Sun Allah, and started writing essays, poetry, Arabic lessons. He found meaning in history, especially Black and African heritage, but he never escaped the shadow of Irene's death. On the evening of September 20, 2024, Freddie was led into the chamber. For his final meal, he ordered 2 cheeseburgers, some French fries, a well-done ribeye steak, 6 chicken wings, and 2 strawberry sodas, as well as a slice of apple pie. He declined to make a final statement. Instead, he turned to his attorney and simply said, "Bye." He was given a single dose of pentobarbital, and at 6:55 p.m., he was gone. Freddie Eugene Owens was 46 years old. The next to die was Marcellus Williams, exactly 4 days later. Let's see why. On August 11, 1998, a quiet street inside a gated community in University City, Missouri, became the backdrop for a crime that would divide the state for decades. That evening, 42-year-old Felicia Gale was found murdered in her own home. Her husband returned home to discover a nightmare: Leisha's body on the floor, stabbed more than 40 times with a butcher knife pulled from her kitchen. But without witnesses, the case ran cold quickly. In May 1999, almost 10 months after the killing, the family announced a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction in the case. And soon people were talking. Investigators turned their focus on Marcellus Williams, a 29-year-old with a long rap sheet who was already serving time for an unrelated robbery. A former cellmate claimed Marcellus had confessed behind bars, and his girlfriend said that she saw blood on his shirt and a laptop in his car, one that matched the description of a stolen item from Leisha's home. A third man said that Marcellus sold him that laptop. This was enough. In 2001, a jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death. On September 24, 2024, Marcellus spent his final hours in the prison where he had lived for over 2 decades. He had converted to Islam behind bars and was known among fellow inmates as Khalifa. He wrote poetry, led prayers, and spoke often about justice, not just for himself, but for others. His last meal was chicken wings and tater tots. And his final statement, written down the morning of his execution, were simple: "All praise be to Allah in every situation." At 6 p.m. he was executed by lethal injection in Missouri. At 6:10 he was pronounced dead. Marcellus Williams was 55 years old. At the very same time, another execution was carried out in Texas. On January 29, 2008, a young couple was out searching for wildlife along Seawall Boulevard in Galveston, Texas, when they stumbled upon a horror they could never forget. Lying near the roadside was the body of a baby boy, just 3 months old. His name was Elijah Mullis. His skull had been crushed. His tiny frame was limp and lifeless, the only evidence of a brutal death that shocked even seasoned investigators. But it didn't take long to piece together what had happened. 3 days later, the boy's father, 21-year-old Travis Mullis, walked into a police station in Philadelphia and confessed.
And at that point, I had hit my breaking point with stress, and I was scared, I was panicking, I hit my breaking point and I broke. At that point, I felt that the only way to make him to stop crying was to kill him.
He didn't just kill his son, he strangled him, stomped on his head until his skull gave way, and left him like garbage by the side of the road. The reason? He wouldn't stop crying. At his 2011 trial in Galveston, Travis didn't deny what he did. Jurors listened to his confession, watched the video, and heard from other children he had abused before the murder. They didn't hesitate and sentenced him to death. After 13 years, a death warrant was signed for September 24th, and Travis accepted it. "It was my decision that put me here," he told his lawyers. He wasn't allowed to choose a special final meal and just had what was on the menu that day. In his final moments, Travis spoke calmly. He thanked the prison staff for showing him humanity, and he apologized to Elijah's mother and her family. He said he had no regrets about giving up his appeals, only sorrow for what he had done. If you want to read his full statement, you can pause the video here. At 7:01 p.m., a lethal dose of pentobarbital ended his life. Travis James Muller was 38 years old. And just 2 days later, the next inmate was strapped to the gurney. Let's find out what he did. On June 19, 1992, inside a quiet Oklahoma City convenience store, 31-year-old Kenneth Mears was standing behind the counter when 2 armed men stormed in. It was nearly 10:15 p.m., and Kenneth had been working late with 2 employees, both young men who knew him well. But just moments later, Kenneth was lying on the floor with a gunshot wound to the face, and the robbers were gone without taking anything. The killers were identified quickly: 20-year-old Emmanuel Littlejohn and 25-year-old Glen Bethany. Both had long rap sheets, and both had debts to pay. The theory was simple. They needed money, and robbing a neighborhood store seemed fast and easy. But what wasn't simple was finding out who pulled the trigger. Inside the store, one witness swore it was Emmanuel holding the gun, while outside, others described the shooter as the taller of the 2, which pointed more toward Glen, but there were no fingerprints. There was no security footage, no bullet casing, and no clear answer. Only Kenneth's body left behind. Emmanuel fled the state. He was picked up in Wichita, Kansas, 5 days later. Glen was arrested sooner, just a few miles from the scene. Prosecutors split the cases. Glen got life without parole, but Emmanuel got death. Over the next 3 decades, Emmanuel filed appeal after appeal. But all his federal challenges failed, and his execution date was set. For his last meal, he had meat pizza, Coca-Cola, and 2 slices of cheesecake the night before. In his final words, he turned to his mother and daughter and said softly, "Everything is going to be okay. I love you." At 10:17 a.m. on September 26, 2024, Emmanuel was pronounced dead by lethal injection. Emmanuel Littlejohn was 52 years old. That very same day, Alabama also carried out an execution. But what for? On August 5, 1999, in Pelham, Alabama, 34-year-old Alan Miller walked into work with a loaded .40 caliber Glock. And by the end of the day, 3 men were dead. He shot his co-workers Lee Holdbrooks and Christopher Yancey inside a heating and air conditioning warehouse. Then he got in his truck and drove 5 miles to another job site, one he had been fired from years earlier, and shot his former supervisor, Terry Jarvis, in cold blood. When police caught up with him, it took 4 officers and 4 sets of handcuffs to get him restrained. Allen said that he believed they'd been spreading rumors about him, and he wanted to shut them up for good. He stood trial the following year. The murders weren't in question. He never denied pulling the trigger. But a defense psychiatrist said Allen suffered from severe mental illness. However, the jury didn't waver. In July 2000, Allen was sentenced to death. He spent 24 years on death row. On the evening of September 26, 2024, Allen was strapped to a gurney. He had eaten a hamburger steak, baked potato, and fries for his last meal. When asked for his final words, Allen said, "I didn't do anything to be in here." Then the gas was administered. Witnesses said he shook for nearly 2 minutes, pulling at his restraints and gasping. Then it slowed, and his body went still. The nitrogen flowed for 15 minutes, and at 6:38 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Allen Eugene Miller was 59 years old. The next execution was carried out on October 1st. Let's see what he did. On November 30th, 1989, in Houston, Texas, 3 lives were taken in an apartment that had already seen too much. Bonita Edwards, a 38-year-old widow, shared that space with her twin daughters, Burnett and Annette, just 16 years old. That night, Garcia Glen White showed up angry and high, looking for a safe space to use his drug and wanting to have sex. But when Bonita refused his advances, things spiraled. Garcia pulled a knife and attacked. He stabbed Bonita again and again, and when she was dead, he went after her daughters, one, then murdering them both. Burnett was found in the bathroom with a towel shoved in her mouth, and Annette was left in her room half covered by a blanket. The bodies stayed there for 2 days before Bonita's boyfriend found them, and by then, Garcia was long gone. But this wasn't all. Before he showed up at Bonita's house, he went to a drug house where he got in an argument with a 27-year-old prostitute named Greta Williams, who ended up beaten to death that very same night. 6 years passed, and there were no leads. But then, in July 1995, Garcia and a man named Tecumseh Emmanuel walked into a Houston convenience store, intending to rob the place. But somewhere between threats and panic, Garcia pulled the trigger, and the clerk, Hy Van Pham, was dead. While being interrogated for that crime, his accomplice told the police that this wasn't his first time killing someone and told them about the 1989 murders. Garcia first blamed someone else, even naming a man who had already died at the time of the murders. But then the truth came out. DNA evidence confirmed the story. His blood and were found at the scene, and he admitted to sexually assaulting one of the girls. In May 1996, Garcia was indicted for the murders of Burnett and Annette. He went to trial 2 months later. The jury took little time, and he was sentenced to death. He was never convicted for the other 3 murders. After spending 28 years on death row, his time finally came on October 1st, 2024. He wasn't allowed to choose a special meal. He just had what the other inmates were having. While strapped to the gurney, he apologized repeatedly to the Edwards family. "I regret, I apologize, and I pray that you can find peace," he said. Then he thanked the guards for treating him like a person and sang part of a hymn, "I Trust in God." If you want to read his full statement, you can pause the video here. At 6:56 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Garcia Glen White was 61 years old. Alabama was the next state to execute someone just 2 weeks later. Before the sun came up on August 20th, 2016, the quiet town of Citronelle, Alabama, woke to horror. Tucked away on Jim Platt Road was a small rural house where 5 adults had gone to sleep. But by sunrise, all of them were dead, their bodies hacked and shot inside the home they thought was safe. And the one responsible was Derrick Dearman. His targets weren't strangers. Inside the house was Lynetta Lester, his ex-girlfriend, who had left him days earlier to escape what she called an abusive relationship. Afraid he would hurt her, Lynetta went to stay at her brother's home, hoping that the space would be safe. But it wasn't. Derrick had found her anyway. First, Derrick killed Lynetta's brother Joseph Turner and his wife Shannon, along with another couple, Justin and Chelsea Reed, who was 5 months pregnant, and a family friend, Robert Lee Brown. And after the massacre, Derrick took Lynetta and her brother's baby and fled the state. He drove them across the border into Mississippi, where he lived. He held them for hours before finally letting them go. Police found all 5 victims where Lynetta said they would be, still and savaged in the home. At his father's urging, Derrick eventually turned himself in. Derrick was charged with 6 counts of capital murder, 5 adults, and Chelsea's unborn child. Under Alabama law, the fetus counted. He was also charged with 2 counts of kidnapping and 1 count of extortion, and it took them just days to sentence him to death. On the night of October 17, 2024, after 6 years on death row, Derrick had a seafood platter consisting of fried catfish, 3 fried shrimp, 3 boiled shrimp, 3 fried oysters, 3 onion rings, a deviled crab, and 2 sides for his final meal. Minutes before his death, he addressed the victims' families with a cracked voice and wet eyes. "Forgive me. This is not for me. This is for you. I've taken so much." Then, to his own family, he simply said, "Y'all already know I love y'all." At 6 p.m., a lethal dose of pentobarbital entered Derrick's veins, and at 6:14, he was pronounced dead. Derrick Ryan Dearman was 36 years old. In November, the next inmate was executed in South Carolina. But why? On the morning of September 16, 1999, Richard Moore limped into a Spartanburg convenience store with a desperate plan. Addicted and broke, he intended to rob the place. He didn't bring a weapon. He said he never meant to kill anyone. But by the time he walked out, 42-year-old store clerk James Mahoney was dead, shot through the chest with his own gun. Richard had spent most of his adult life tangled in addiction and violence. After moving from Michigan to South Carolina with his partner in the early 90s, he racked up charges for burglary, robbery, assault. His addiction drove nearly everything. That morning, it drove him into Nicky's. What happened next was chaotic. A witness said Richard and James struggled, that James pulled a gun and Richard wrestled it away. Then James grabbed a second firearm and shots were fired. But it was James who fell to the ground, and Richard grabbed the cash drawer and fled, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the arm. A mile and a half away, he crashed his pickup into a utility pole. And when a deputy arrived, he didn't run, he sat in the bed of his truck and confessed. The stolen money was soaked in his blood. At trial, Richard's attorneys argued self-defense. He hadn't come to kill, he came to rob. But the jury saw a man with a violent past who walked into a store and left a man dead. On October 22, 2001, he was sentenced to death. On October 4th, after spending 23 years on death row, Richard received his death warrant. He would die on November 1st. That night, Richard was led into the death chamber at Broad River. His final meal had been a feast: steak, catfish, shrimp, scalloped potatoes, greens, pie, cake, and grape juice. His final words were for the people he hurt. "I am deeply sorry for the pain and sorrow I caused you all." Then to his children and granddaughters, "I love you and I am so proud of you." He was pronounced dead at 6:24 p.m. Richard Bernard Moore was 59 years old. 3 weeks later, the next man was put to death. But what did he do? On the night of February 21st, 1994, Vicky DeBlue was just trying to get home. She was 37, hitchhiking from Tennessee to Louisiana, and had 2 kids waiting for her down south. But somewhere along I-59, she climbed into the wrong vehicle. Inside were 4 young men, drunk, high, and restless. Carey Dale Grayson was the oldest of them. He was 19. They told her they would give her a ride. Instead, they veered off course into the woods of Jefferson County, Alabama. What happened next would be described by investigators as one of the most grotesque and senseless murders they had ever seen. Once they parked, Vicky was attacked. First, they threw beer bottles at her, then they wrestled her to the ground. The 4 of them kicked and stomped her as she cried and fought to crawl away. When that didn't kill her, Carey and Kenneth Loggins stood on her throat until she went still. But they weren't done, not even close. They loaded her body into a truck, drove to Bald Rock Mountain, stripped her of her belongings, and sexually violated her corpse. Then they threw her off a cliff. Hours later, they came back to mutilate what was left. When she was found 4 days later, she had 180 knife wounds, her fingers were cut off, and her organs were cut out. When police found her, they had to identify her through an old spinal X-ray. Her face was too damaged to recognize. A few weeks later, one of the other boys had bragged about the killing and even showed off a severed finger. All 4 were caught. At trial in 1996, the jury took less than an hour to sentence 3 of them to death, and the youngest one, 16-year-old Louis Mangione, was given life. However, since Kenneth Loggins and Trace Duncan were 17 at the time of the crime, their death sentences were overturned when the rules for minors changed in 2005. That left Carey as the last man standing on death row. He spent 28 years there, bouncing through appeals. But by 2024, there was no turning back. For his final meal, he ordered soft tacos, beef burritos, chips, guacamole, and a Baja Blast. Minutes before the execution, he cursed the prison staff and raised both middle fingers from the gurney. He started with, "For you, you need to f*** off," before a warden pulled the microphone away. The gas began flowing at 6:12 p.m. He jerked, gasped, and kicked under the sheet. Witnesses counted more than a dozen strained breaths. By 6:21, he went still, and by 6:33, he was pronounced dead. Carey Dale Grayson was 50 years old. That was just brutal. Let's continue with the next one. Rowan Ford was supposed to be safe in her bed. She was 9, bright, trusting, the kind of kid who smiled with her whole face. But on the night of November 3rd, 2007, that innocence was stolen forever. Rowan vanished from her home in Stella, Missouri, while her mother was working a late shift, and for 6 days the town held its breath. But when search teams found her body deep inside a cave in McDonald County, hope turned to horror. She was dumped like trash, half buried in leaves, stripped from the waist down, and strangled with a rope. The crime scene was disturbing enough, but the betrayal behind it broke something in that town, because the men who were responsible for Rowan's death weren't strangers. One was her stepfather, David Spears, and the other, Christopher Leroy Collings, was the man she called Uncle Chris. David and Chris were friends, and Chris had once lived in their home. He crashed in the basement for months, and Rowan liked him. She trusted him. But on that night, after a round of heavy drinking, he abducted her from her home. He took her back to his trailer where he raped her. He later told police he wanted to bring her back home, but freaked out when she looked at him, when she saw his face. He didn't want to leave a witness, so he strangled her, and with David's help, they dumped her body in the cave. After being arrested, Chris confessed. He didn't deny what he did, but that didn't soften the blow. In court, jurors sat through testimony about Rowan's final moments, how she was groomed, betrayed, and murdered by a man she thought she could trust. In 2012, it took them only 48 minutes to decide his fate: death. They said the murder was outrageously and wantonly vile. David was handed an 11-year prison sentence. But since his time behind bars started the day he was arrested in 2007, he didn't serve the full term. After just over 7 years, he walked out of prison in 2015. And in 2024, after 12 years on death row, Chris's time ran out. On December 3, 2024, he was executed by lethal injection in Missouri. His last meal was a bacon cheeseburger, tater tots, breaded mushrooms, and a chef salad. Before the drugs were administered, he apologized to Rowan's family. "Right or wrong, I accept this situation for what it is," he said in a written final statement. "To anyone that I have hurt in this life, I am sorry. I hope that you are able to get closure and move on." But for her family, it was too little, too late. He was pronounced dead at 6:10 p.m. Christopher Leroy Collings was 49 years old. Let's continue with the next one. After spending 25 years on death row, time ran out for Joseph Edward Corcoran. But how did he end up on death row in the first place? In the early hours of July 26, 1997, something snapped in Joe. He was 22 years old, living in a small Fort Wayne home with his brother James, his sister's fiancé Robert Turner, and 2 family friends, Timothy Bricker and Douglas Stillwell. That night, the men were doing what young people do, watching TV, eating pizza, and just enjoying themselves. But upstairs, Joe was stewing. He was sitting upstairs in his bedroom thinking they were talking about him, about his past, about the rumors that never went away. Because 5 years earlier, his parents, Jack and Catherine Corcoran, had been murdered. They were both shot dead in their home, and Joe had been charged with their murders. His friends later told investigators that Joe once offered them $200 and a shotgun if they would kill his parents for him. They said most of their conversations back then circled around one thing: how to hurt people. Sometimes animals too. The police heard all these stories and arrested him. But later at trial, the jury acquitted Joe because of lack of evidence. There was no gun, no confession, just whispers. And for Joe, those whispers now were louder than ever. Then he made a decision. He picked up his semi-automatic rifle, went down the stairs, and opened fire. The first 3 men never stood a chance. The last one, Douglas, tried to run, but Joe caught him before he made it out. When it was over, 4 men were dead, and Joe simply stepped outside and calmly told a neighbor to call the police. They found him waiting outside the house. Inside, the house was littered with shell casings, and the most disturbing thing was found in the attic. It held a small armory, 20 to 30 weapons, some even custom modified. He was tried in 1999, and the jury returned 4 death sentences. And 25 years later, when the date was set, December 18, 2024, he wrote the judges directly. He just told them to let it happen. At midnight on December 18, 2024, he was strapped to a gurney at Indiana State Prison. For his last meal, he chose Ben & Jerry's ice cream. He spent his final hours with family, including a wife he had married while in prison. Joe declined to give a final statement. "Not really," he said, when asked for his final words. "Let's get this over with." Then the drugs began to flow, and 8 minutes later, at 12:44 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Joseph Edward Corcoran was 49 years old. Let's move on to the last person executed in 2024. After 16 years, Kevin Ray Underwood was executed by lethal injection. But what did he do? On April 12, 2006, 10-year-old Jamie Rose Boland walked home alone after a school event. Her father wasn't there. He was still at work like most days. But Kevin, their quiet neighbor from a few doors down, was, and he saw his chance. He stopped Jamie outside and told her she could come see his pet rat and watch some cartoons, and without second thought, she followed him upstairs. Inside his apartment, he turned on SpongeBob SquarePants to keep her calm. Then, without warning, he grabbed a wooden cutting board and hit her in the back of the head again and again. When she hit the floor, he climbed on top of her and pressed his hands around her neck until she stopped moving. He later told investigators it took nearly 20 minutes for her to die. Afterward, he tried to her body, but he couldn't perform. And now he was wondering how he could get rid of the body. So he dragged her to the bathtub, took a knife, and tried to remove her head, but again he failed. So he decided to wrap her in plastic sheeting, and he placed her in a large plastic storage tub, sealing it shut. Then he disassembled her bicycle and hid the pieces inside his apartment, hoping it would look like she had simply vanished. But authorities quickly focused on him, as he was the last person to be seen with her. When officers knocked on his door, Kevin gave them permission to search his apartment. At first, he acted calm, but that changed when investigators spotted the large plastic storage bin sealed with duct tape in his bedroom closet. They also found a disassembled purple bike, metal skewers, and a meat tenderizer. That's when Kevin broke down. "Go ahead and arrest me," he said. "She's in there. I hit her and chopped her up." He began hyperventilating and told agents, "I'm going to burn in hell." Later, Kevin gave a full confession. He said he had spent months planning the murder, motivated by violent fantasies involving sex and cannibalism. He told investigators he wanted to cut off her head and keep it on his desk, so it could, like, watch me. He said he planned to sleep next to her body for a day or two, and then cook and eat it. At trial, the jury needed just 23 minutes to find him guilty. They watched his videotaped confession, heard him talk about how he wanted to know what human flesh tasted like, and how he wanted to sleep next to a corpse. On April 3rd, the judge made it official. He was sentenced to death. After 16 years, the state set a date, December 19th, 2024, his 45th birthday. On the morning of his birthday, Kevin Ray Underwood ate chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes with gravy, a cheeseburger, French fries, pinto beans, a hot roll, and a soda. He cried as the drugs entered his veins. "The decision to execute me on my birthday and 6 days before Christmas was a needlessly cruel thing to do to my family," he said. "But I'm very sorry for what I did, and I wish I could take it back." He was pronounced dead at 10:14 a.m. Kevin Ray Underwood was 45 years old. This concludes all executions carried out in 2024. Subscribe if you want to see more cases like these, and tell me in the comments which case is still sitting in your head right now.